Sekulow.
Welcome to Jay Sekulow Live. This is Jordan Sekulow. We are taking your phone calls, 1-800-684-3110. But let me just tell you that we are looking forward right now to the threat from Iran, especially posed by a potential Biden administration. We are realists at the ACLJ. We're attorneys. And when you're realists and when you're attorneys, you know what you prepare for? Worst case scenarios. And we're getting closer and closer to worst case scenarios. We don't yet know what will happen in the Georgia Senate races, but some of the foreign policy realm is really conducted outside of Congress, and is focused on, that's where the president and the Supreme Court's been clear on that. The Constitution's clear on that. The president has the most power when he's acting in foreign policy. And that is why, again, this Iranian threat that is emerging again, which was really kept under wraps by the Trump administration, by these new peace deals, by basically
isolating Iran.
What President Trump was doing through these peace deals was building the coalition to isolate Iran and make it very difficult for Iran. We had Saudis they've given the air rights for Israel to fly over commercial airliners, and they're doing so publicly. This is not just like private behind the scenes intel work. So they were building that coalition, but the Biden team could come in and just totally eviscerate that.
Yeah, and I think the reality is they probably will. Now, we've got...
they're threatening not to even send the F-35s that were part of the deal.
Right. So this is what you've got. So we've got in our team at the ACLJ, we have depth here. We've got an office in Jerusalem. Skip Ash is in charge of our international law group, retired colonel from the United States Army. Wes Smith, retired colonel from the United States Army and also a senior military advisor to the ACLJ. I'm going to start with Wes and then go to Skip, and that is the threat from Iran now under an incoming Biden administration. The president isolated them. We had all those peace agreements signed. How's it going to look now?
It looks pretty bad. It really does. Joe Biden has indicated he wants to re-enter the JCPOA, even though it did nothing to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. It just delayed it by a decade. Iran continues on their nuclear weapons program, unabated. What is going to happen if we don't do something is the most dangerous weapon in the world will be in the hands of the most dangerous country in the world. Already, they're violating the JCPOA. The IAEA 2 weeks ago said that Iran has already enriched 12 times the amount of nuclear material allowed by the JCPOA. They've increased the number of centrifuges, and they've buried them deep underground. They've also continued with their ballistic missile program. Iran is a threat. They are intent on acquiring a nuclear weapon, and the only hope of that not happening is for the world to unite and for the Biden administration not to change what President Trump has done.
The most dangerous weapon in the world with the most dangerous country in the world. Skip, how do you see it?
I see it exactly the same way. The people in Iran are religious supremacists who believe in an apocalyptic vision of how the world should proceed. They believe that they are the chosen people to bring this about. And the Trump administration was very wise in getting out of that agreement, cutting off their funding. So now they're in a very bad place economically. It looks like the incoming administration, the Biden administration, is going to reverse that to give them back the money, just like the Obama administration did, to give them the money they need to support terrorism and to support their missile and nuclear program, and that's going to be a disaster not only for the Middle East, but for the rest of the world.
I mean, listen, we're going to get into this in great length because this is a threat to the United States, Jordan.
Absolutely. A huge threat to the U.S., but we've got the team ready to keep you updated and ready to fight. Remember, December Matching Challenge Month. Support the work of the ACLJ at aclj.org. Donate today, aclj.org. Double the impact of your donation. It is so important, folks, because this is critical work that we are going to be doing and engaging all of our international offices as well to fight back against what could be Iran on the move once again. We'll be right back.
Because of the support of every member of the ACLJ, one of the practice areas that we've been able to develop is Freedom of Information Act requests, or FOIA requests.
It's thousands of pages of paper, and in those thousands of pages of paper, you usually find a nugget.
The goal here is to gather the puzzle pieces. Sometimes you don't know which ones will be important until they become important.
Government agencies acting out of control.
We have exposed that in our FOIA litigation, and we do that every day that we bring these cases.
It is your statutory right as an American citizen to have access to documents that reveal how the government is functioning, how your government is functioning.
Do you remember the Iran deal? There was a video about what took place on that deal, and it was edited. The edit took out the key part of what was going on. State Department, White House, editing videos to keep it from the American public.
We know because our FOIA litigation got that document.
We took it to the IRS. No one ever does that.
And what the IRS was doing was violating the Constitution and statutory law. Because of the litigation we engaged in, they can't do what they were doing before.
They've been hiding behind in the shadows. These FOIAs bring them to light.
All of this information came because we went to court to get the information.
Many times when we make these requests, the requests actually end up in court as the bureaucracy fights back to withhold the information. But that's okay because the law is on our side. We are entitled to the information that is in these requests that we have made.
We've got the declassified list of Obama administration officials who started asking to unmask.
We have caught them now.
They have no one in there to protect them anymore. They were used to the bureaucracy protecting them.
Those of you that support the ACLJ, this is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Support the work of the ACLJ with our matching challenge. Go to aclj.org. It's all because of you. And you can double the impact your donation today at aclj.org. Go online and donate now. All right, welcome back to Jay Sekulow Live. So we're talking about this idea, which, unfortunately, we probably wouldn't have to be talking about if it wasn't, somewhat likely that it was going to be the Biden administration coming in, and we definitely have to prepare for it, whether you like that or not, to really redo what has been such a successful Middle East policy under the Trump administration, with peace deals with Israel, kind of ignoring this Palestinian issue and saying we can still make peace with the Gulf states, which, by the way, isn't just about Israel and those Gulf states making peace. It's about building a coalition that isolates Iran further. And also so that if there were the need for a military attack, that they had this coalition, by recognizing and making these peace agreements with Israel, business relations, travel, tourism, flights going back and forth now between these countries, that Iran would have a serious coalition that would be fully armed and ready to respond to any kind of Iranian aggression, even their aggression through the proxies they use, like Hezbollah and other groups. But we are going to have to be ready for the attempt to dismantle that, because I will tell you that those Gulf state leaders, they're going to be very weary of now these agreements if they don't get what they were supposed to out of it, like F-35s ultimately delivered at certain standpoints, because they've got advisors on the Biden side saying, well, maybe we shouldn't send those.
Exactly. And I want to go, Wes, you wrote a piece that's up on aclj.org called The Existential Threat Posed by Iran's Nuclear Program. It keys off on the fact that just a couple weeks back, the top Iranian nuclear scientist, military nuclear scientist, was killed purportedly by the Israelis.
Right, he was. He was both the brains and the passion behind their nuclear weapons research and development program. He was in charge of the Ahmad program, which, interestingly enough, that was using the Iranian military for the research and development towards a nuclear bomb. And so that's why he was taken out. And going forward, what Iran is saying with the potential Biden administration coming in is that they will not even consider negotiations with the U.S. unless we lift sanctions. Meanwhile, a Biden transition spokesperson has said, we would be open to possibly lifting some sanctions. And also, and as a condition for that, Iran, they don't have to go back to where they were before they started violating that flawed Iran nuclear deal. They just need to stop where they are. Don't do any more going forward. It is crazy. The Gulf states and the other Arab nations, they realize that Iran is a threat to their national security, to their existence. That's why they've been so open to making peace with Israel. And they are very, very alarmed at a possible change going forward with the new presidential administration.
But what Jordan said, and I want to go to Skip Ash, who heads up our international law group, is that there are certain understandings that these countries had from the United States, what our policies would be, how we would help them, kind of a coalescing of relations and arrangements. That could well be out the window now, and how does that impact the situation? Skip?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the threat and the danger here, because we have a situation where the incoming administration looks like it's going to totally reject the successes of the Trump administration just because they do not like the author of those policies. They're not looking at the success. For decades, the situation in the Middle East was a disaster under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Donald Trump came in and he turned things upside down. He got our embassy moved to Jerusalem, where everybody said that would cause chaos throughout the Middle East. Nothing happened. He has proposed a settlement for the Palestinians. They've done what they normally do. They've missed another opportunity to have their own state. But what that has done is that has opened up these other Gulf kingdoms and emirates to consider Israel as a partner, especially in light of the Iranian threat. Remember, Iran is a hegemonic power. They look back that they were once the Persian Empire, and they want to reestablish that as a Shiite Persian Empire throughout the Middle East. And the Sunni kingdoms in the Middle East are fearful of that, and rightly so, and therefore they need to have both the United States and the strongest country in the Middle East, which is Israel, as allies. By doing that, they can check the threat of Iran throughout the Middle East. And I think that is something that if this administration gives away, it'll move us back decades.
Now, for those of you that are new to the ACLJ, let me explain something to you. We've got offices in Jerusalem. We have UN status through our European Center for Law and Justice. We've got, obviously, with Skip and Wes, we've got military expertise. We have the former director of national intelligence as a senior advisor to the ACLJ on national security issues. So we have depths here. We've argued cases at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Back this time last year, we were in The Hague. So we've done this. We're there. We're active in this. But you're looking at a dramatic shift of policy, a policy that has been working very well for the United States for the last 4 years and culminated, as Jordan said, in these 4 arrangements. But that is about to be shelved. And that's, unfortunately, that never came out during the campaign.
No.
What was at stake here?
Well, I think that, again, some of this was the Biden team trying to play it down. And honestly, people were so focused on COVID and domestic policies, and there's been such a calmness to our foreign policy, troop withdrawals in Iraq and Afghanistan, the destruction of ISIS and the caliphate there, and any attempt for them to come back was quickly, being put down in places like North Africa. You had the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi dead. You had the top Iranian, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, dead by American forces. So we had weakened our enemies in the Middle East to a point where they were even at a rebuilding stage. They were being hit with viruses in their nuclear programs. They were hit with sanctions again. But you see quickly this can reverse. And this is a region of the world built on deals. And if these deals that President Trump made aren't made good as they continue on by the Biden administration, we're going to be back to square one again.
You wrote, Wes, in your piece, it says, Iran is unrepentant and even now proceeds unabated with its march toward acquiring a nuclear weapon. The threat of a nuclear-armed Iran is real, and bearing drastic action will take place at some point in the future. Iran's leaders are not rational, and it's deploying even a single nuclear bomb at some point is a very real existential threat to the region, to Israel, and possibly the United States. Yeah,
absolutely it is. And more than likely, based on their modus operandi, if Iran acquired a nuclear bomb, they like plausible deniability, to coin a phrase that's been used recently, and they would probably not detonate such a bomb if provoked or not provoked themselves. They would give a smaller version of this kind of weapon to one of their many crazed proxy groups and let that group actually detonate the weapon. And those groups are completely irrational and would probably do it. You look at the situation in Iran, And the people on the left, what they're advocating, changing the policies that have been working for the last 4 years, it reminds me of what happened on the Korean Peninsula. We used negotiations and giving them vast amounts of aid, trying to talk North Korea out of acquiring a nuclear weapon. It was an unmitigated disaster, so that today our only recourse on the Korean Peninsula is to warn Kim Jong-il not to use it and to hope that he does not. Do you really want that same kind of situation in the Middle East?
With the Ayatollahs?
Yeah, because if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then all options are gone except warning them not to use them, and there is no guarantee that they won't.
Yeah, Skip, I was thinking the same thing, and the comparisons to Korea is interesting, but the fact is that the powder keg of the Middle East can be drastically reshaped in about a moment's notice.
Absolutely, and we have to understand that the United States, as a nation, we tend to be very short-term in our view. We're not long-term. When you go over to Europe and you go over to the Middle East, these people remember slights that are centuries old, and they're still holding grudges. So they look long-term, and we look short-term. So we think we can make a deal. We've got a deal, and that's going to last. They make a deal. Even within Islam, they can make a deal that's temporary, and when it no longer serves their purposes, they can break it because they have no obligation to be honest in dealing with non-Muslims. And that's a critical thing that we need to keep in mind as we deal with some of these issues. And the Iranians have already demonstrated irrationality by taking our embassy during the Carter administration.
Let's not even think about that again. I mean, that's the kind of things you worry about with this kind of administration coming in. Let me say this also. Later in the program, towards the back half, we did a special documentary on this in Israel where we met with some of the key leaders of that are the Iran experts in Israel. And I was just telling our producers we need to play some of that audio and video for you so you could hear it from them. It is very relevant again today because that is about to be a real threat. All right, we're taking a break. When we come back, we'll take more of your calls. Jordan's letting you know how you support the ACLJ.
Support the work of the ACLJ through our matching challenge at aclj.org. Double the impact of your donation at aclj.org. It's a critical time as we prepare for battle, always at the American Center for Law and Justice. That's at aclj.org. It's how we bring you the broadcast. It's how we have the offices all over the world, policy analysts, attorneys who are able to represent clients at no cost. It's all because of your financial support to the ACLJ, our government affairs team in Washington, D.C. All because of you. Donate today. Be part of our matching challenge. Double the impact of your donation through the month of December at aclj.org.
I was at a board meeting at Jews for Jesus, and the executive director said, we've got a case. The Supreme Court had just granted review. It was about literature distribution at airports.
We wanted to have the Bible study meet in the school, but it turned into a problem when the principal said, no, you can't have it.
I told her that I wanted to sing Noel, and she said, the principal said that we can't have anything to do with Christ in our songs.
We marched around the country defending evangelism in Chicago, in Boston, in New York, Atlanta, Texas, Southern California, Northern California, and points in between.
We got a letter one evening from the IRS saying they wanted all this information that we all knew immediately was not right.
How do you fight the government? How do you fight the IRS?
Tea Party groups say they're being targeted by the Internal Revenue Service, and they're enlisting the aid of the American Center for Law and Justice.
They were trying to shut groups down that they disagreed with. This was very, very serious.
The federal courts do not need to become monitors of state trespass actions, and that's all this is.
We were looking for the right to speak our minds and our consciences, and we won that right today.
Religious persecution is a situation where your life is literally put in jeopardy simply because of what you believe.
Can you help? Can you do something? He's on death row, and so we launched an international campaign. His freedom now rests solely on diplomatic efforts by the United States government and world leaders dedicated to human rights.
The release of Andrew Brunson. He is the American evangelical from North Carolina, held in Turkey for more than 2 years.
There was an Air Force plane that came from Germany that had been on standby. We're flying, and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, we're really out of Turkey and free again.
Sekulow Live. This is Jordan Sekulow. You know what we're talking about, which is Iran, this threat from Iran, which can quickly reemerge. And we were in a situation where Iran was still a threat, obviously, with an Ayatollah and this religious-based regime with extreme ideology and proxies like Hezbollah operating. But remember, we kind of crushed down on what was going on in Syria through the Trump administration. We were building this coalition under the Trump administration, working with Israel and Gulf states. But if two things happen, if the Biden team comes in and doesn't make good on the deals that were made between the Trump administration, those trilateral and bilateral deals with the Gulf states, they're not going to be so interested in they're not going to be prepared. They're not going to have the F-35s to defend themselves. And it will be right back to the scenario of the U.S. will only move on Middle East peace after dealing with the Palestinian situation, and we're going to go back to giving Iran sanction relief, as well as going back to a nuclear deal, which was a nuclear deal for Iran, so that Iran could stay on a safe path to a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I mean, it was a nuclear deal because it was to give them nuclear weapons. So it wasn't as if this was some great giant surprise here. So, Wes, I was thinking about this. You've got a piece up, and I mentioned it earlier in the broadcast, the existential threat posed by Iran's nuclear program. How would you define that existential threat?
You know, they have made it very, very clear. They are a sworn enemy of the United States, and they have called for the destruction of Israel. The only thing that has stopped them from destroying Israel is that they don't have the capability to destroy Israel. So, you know, existential means it threatens your existence. And they are an existential threat to Israel. They could be to us because, as I mentioned earlier, you know, they might or might not deploy a nuclear weapon. It is unlikely they would have the capability or the inclination to deploy it in the United States, but there's nothing to stop them from giving a nuclear weapon to a terrorist group which has no such reservations, no such rationality to do that. Them having a nuclear weapon, the danger of that simply cannot be overstated.
One of the things we also needed to look at, because they're not exactly related, but it's interesting, and that is, and you spend time on the Korean Peninsula, and that is the whole issue between the approachment of Korea that the President Trump is engaged in and what a Joe Biden approachment looks like. But before we get to that, I think it's important for people to understand, Jordan, we at the ACLJ have unique experience here and an office in the Middle East.
That's right in the heart of really where all these conflicts want to converge, which is Jerusalem. And there we've mostly been defending Israel, you know, at the International Criminal Court and The Hague. But this if they go back to this scenario, we'll be also moving back to this scenario, a situation where Israel's defense and survival will be at stake again. So it won't be just defending them in international courts at the ACLJ. It will be defending the state of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, right to exist, and fight terrorism out of the Gaza Strip, fight terrorism out of the West Bank, and not get pressured into some horrendous deal or themselves become sanctioned. Remember, the final act of the Obama administration was to step back and allow the UN Security Council to condemn Israel, Dad. That was the final act at the UN by the Obama administration. They didn't vote yes, but they could have stopped it because any permanent 5-member can veto it, and they didn't. But that was the final act. So we're going to be right back.
Right where we left off.
Yep, 8 years ago.
You had a 4-year reprieve from ridiculous, and you're going to go right back to ridiculous again. And Wes, they were very dangerous, the Obama administration, in my view, at the UN.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, they teamed up with some of our supposed allies to be an even bigger threat to Middle East peace and to the United States as well as to Israel. And of course, don't forget, they gave Iran in this whole process billions of dollars, both in cash and releasing, their financial assets in the international markets. And so, it's really crazy. And here's the thing about this, Jay. Our European allies are not helping us on this. President Trump has almost stood alone in some cases. They are the ones who 2 months ago at the United Nations Security Council refused to extend the arms embargo on Iran. They're the ones that the signatories to the JCPOA are still in the JCPOA according to them, even though Iran is violating it, and that doesn't stop them from saying it's still in effect. And then in addition to that, if you look at what our European allies are doing, they have tried to circumvent the sanctions placed on Iran by the United States. And so it's like there is an epidemic of naivete on the part of the left, on the part of the Biden team, and on the part of some of our European allies.
But Jordan, as you said, we're going to be right back in the quagmire.
Yes.
And so what we're going to have to do is fight very hard, very aggressively, both in courts and, like the international courts, when those comes
Israel's
up.
right to exist.
The right of the United Nations. We are, again, ACLJ uniquely positioned. We have consultative status at the United Nations. We are an recognized NGO. We could go in there, and we have in the past on behalf of Israel. We're going to have to do that again because this administration, because he's appointing the same people.
It's the same people. It's the same John Kerry types, and John Kerry's going to be part of this administration too. I think he's a climate czar or something. But it's the same ideas that, one, we always have to have consensus. Rick Grinnell's talked a lot about that on this broadcast, how that has been a huge barrier to the U.S. making progress in foreign policy that was knocked down under the Trump administration. It wasn't about consensus. It was about bilateral, unilateral, trilateral deals, and instead of multi-consensus of the whole world. And also, I think, we now have we've added to our team people like Rick, who are the former ambassador to Germany. Germany is one of those countries in the P5+1 that it always wants to circumvent the sanctions on Iran, because they build the stinking tunnels for their nuclear program.
Right.
I mean, I say that word because it's just kind of ironic that the Germans are the ones building tunnels for Iran's nuclear program, and Iran wants to destroy the Jewish state of Israel with a nuclear weapon. But they love the money that comes in. But Iran has been so isolated that it's been difficult for those countries to get around those sanctions. If the Biden team comes in and does what we expect them to do, it will be back to this. I wouldn't doubt that there's going to be, Hezbollah then again gets re-engaged. There becomes more issues in Lebanon, which have been occurring and haven't been getting as much attention as well. More rockets that are going to be fired at Israel. And it's going to just take us back to the same bureaucratic junk State Department, worthless bureaucrats, can't get anything done unless they give it $1 billion. So when a Christian pastor gets picked up and is being held, even by a NATO ally like Turkey, they're not going to worry about Joe Biden putting sanctions on them. They're going to just wonder how big of a check can we get from the U.S. government. That's after we pound the table, by the way, for who knows how many years to get those types of pastors home. And I hope none of them get in that situation. But if they do, we know what it was like under the Obama administration. We were successful. But my gosh, it took a whole lot more work, Dad, then to get those pastors home.
And beating and going, beating the table and congressional hearings, going on media, and every resource we had versus the president picking up the phone and getting the person out.
Yeah, and no billions of dollars sent. So it's why you support the work of the ACLJ, because we're ready to go in those battles. Support our work now at aclj.org. Be part of the matching challenge. Double your impact, your donation. Again, we've got a group of donors ready to match every donation that comes through in December. Donate today, aclj.org.
Here's what I want to say to our ACLJ members, or for those of you that enjoy watching this broadcast. Whether it is going after the deep state, whether it is litigation that we're engaged in, whether it is defending the persecuted church and getting individuals out of prison because of their faith in other countries, whether it's training lawyers to fight for religious liberty, not just here in the United States, but around the globe, whether it is producing a daily, 5 days a week, 1-hour live television and radio broadcast heard on thousands of radio stations, on TV platforms, on social media platforms. Your support of the ACLJ enables us to do all of this. We want to encourage you to support the work of the ACLJ. And when you do that, you're supporting our production teams, our videos, whether it's that kind of production and other things that we are working on. The ACLJ is front and center on this. We're in a matching challenge campaign. Any amount you donate, we get a matching gift for. Go to aclj.org today. That's aclj.org.
Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. And now, your host, Jordan Sekulow.
Welcome back to Jay Sekulow Live. This is Jordan Sekulow. As you know, we've been talking Iran. And we have done a lot of work on the situation with Iran. But we've also brought in a lot of experts, and we're always bringing in new experts. We're bringing in people like the former Director of National Intelligence, Rick Grinnell, to the ACLJ team that'll be strategic advisor throughout this, what potential Biden administration, what they may be doing in this region. He was also the ambassador to Germany, which is a key player in the P5+1 when it comes to the nuclear deal. But we've been working on this for a long time, Dad, and working on it with Israeli officials as well, because of our office in Jerusalem. And interesting, most of our foreign offices are European Center for Law and Justice, Slavic Center for Law and Justice, African Center for Law and Justice. They're specific to the region. But in Jerusalem, it is the ACLJ Jerusalem, because that American support is so key to the Jewish state.
So it's the American Center for Law and Justice, Jerusalem, because it's our office in Jerusalem. Now, a couple years back, more than a couple now, I got to sit down with the leading experts in Israel. We will never get these interviews again. It was incredible. About the threat of Iran. We did a documentary called The Export. But some of these interviews, not some of them, all of them, really shed light on what we are dealing with in the Middle East. We got a reprieve for 4 years. Wes, I call it a 4-year reprieve with a Middle East policy that made sense, where you had new peace treaty signed. Right. But we're about to go back to the old days.
Yeah, it's an overworked cliche, but you remember the cliche that says, the definition of his insanity is to try do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. For decades, the American strategy, in that part of the world did not work. For the last 4 years, we've made incredible progress. It has worked, and yet they want to go back to the old strategy that obviously does not work.
I mean, we destroyed ISIS. We destroyed their caliphate. We put this whole group around of nations around Iran, now we're gonna. And by the way, that's the first time the Bush administration and the Biden administrations won't be that different on. I mean, they're not. The Biden administration would be more anti-Israel than a past Republican administration, but they still weren't willing to make the deals and think outside the box the way we've talked about with the Trump administration, to first and foremost to keep us safe as Americans from the threat from Iran, but also our allies. The more peace deals we can be a part of in the United States, the better in a region of the world that's usually so on fire every time the peace-loving Democrats come into office. Suddenly we're bombing Libya. We've got ISIS. We got the caliphate on the rise. We got a three-way conflict with Russia involved in Syria, and increased troops into Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. The ones that the peace-loving ones are the ones that tend to get us into the most wars. He won the Nobel
Peace Prize, Obama.
Yeah, while he was getting us into conflicts, and then when he needed to get us into do something, like when Syria was gassing their people,
red lines.
Then red lines that they crossed, he does nothing. I'm afraid that's what we're going to go back to. So that means that our team has to be engaged.
Biden was worse.
Biden said, "Do not take out Osama bin Laden."
Yeah, I mean, many of the advisors said on foreign policy, Joe Biden was always had the worst perspective on that. So even worse than what we saw under the Obama years is Joe Biden when it comes to foreign policy.
Wasn't the general said that he was wrong on every decision involving foreign policy?
It was Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense.
What did he say exactly?
He said that in every strategic international decision, he was wrong on every one of them.
There you go.
I mean, so this could be worse than Obama. I mean, which is tough to imagine. But Obama did make the call to take out Osama bin Laden. President Trump made the call to take out Omar al-Baghdadi and get rid of ISIS, get rid of Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. By the way, the Biden administration would have never done a move like that. And was there any response from Iran?
Nothing.
Any danger?
No.
No, because they've been crippled. But now they're thinking they're going to get this whole new wave of cash through sanctions relief. That's why what we're about to show you is so important, because we could be right back facing the type of Iran that has cash, money to spend, and a nuclear program back on track. Support the work of the ACLJ at aclj.org. Remember, because ACLJ Jerusalem, what you're about to see in the rest of the show, because of that, it's because of your support at aclj.org. Donate today.
Thanks to your support of the ACLJ, we have had many victories.
The IRS now formally apologizing to Tea Party groups.
The IRS did the right thing by resolving the case with an injunction that mandated a complete change of the IRS nonprofit tax-exempt work as it relates to issue advocacy organization.
If any group feels like they're being targeted, they can go to federal court and bring our case. That's a victory.
It's one of the most significant wins in the ACLJ's history, to take on the IRS and win.
For more than 27 years, the ACLJ has been fighting for freedom and liberty in the United States and around the globe.
These are young people in their 20s and 30s that are doing this, are fighting for life at a whole new level to beat back the abortion juggernaut. We've got a whole group of young lawyers that are defending them.
Those of us that believe in life know that we're on the right side of history. We understand full well children are children, and they're precious in God's sight, and they're precious in our nation's sight, and they're precious to parents.
But I actually think we're winning. This is one of the social issues we're winning.
The release of Andrew Brunson. He is the American evangelical from North Carolina, held in Turkey for more than 2 years.
They're rushing us to the airport, and there was an Air Force plane that came from Germany that had been on standby. We're flying, and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, now we're really out of Turkey and free again.
We're grateful to ACLJ who put it out to these people, they were getting all this out.
All of the people who prayed for us through ACLJ and through your contacts, I'm thankful, I'm grateful, and actually I'm astounded.
We need your help as we continue this work here in the United States and around the world. Join the matching challenge today, and your tax-deductible donation will be doubled.
We can create a modern international community that is respectful, that is secure, that is prosperous, that there are not tensions, inevitable tensions, between cultures, which I think is extraordinarily important. That's something that's very important to me.
He really wanted this to be a new beginning of the relationship between the United States and the Muslim world. He gave what has now become known as Obama's Cairo Initiative. Perhaps foremost, he wanted me to find a way to reach out to the Muslim world and engage much more with dominantly Muslim nations.
We do not consider ourselves a Christian nation or a Jewish nation or a Muslim nation. We consider ourselves a nation of citizens.
In Iran today, thousands of demonstrators in various locations kept up their public pressure on the Shah.
Khomeini is scheduled to return to Iran Friday after 15 years in exile. Today, the 78-year-old religious leader appeared to be in an uncompromising mood.
One of the chants today was Bring Back Khomeini, this man, presently living in Paris.
It was over 30 years ago that the revolution took place in Iran, led by a cleric named the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had actually been exiled out of Iran under the Shah of Iran's previous regime. Now, the Shah was put in place, and while there were a number of abuses under his regime, there was stability in the region, and radical Islamists did not have a foothold of control of a government. That changed in 1979. When the Ayatollah Khomeini came in and the Shah of Iran was removed from leadership, a major change and shift took place in the region. The region became radical, and it became radical in the context of Islam. And that has shaped not only Iran, but the Middle East, and even in the United States, even today. Now, what this movie is going to do is take a look at radical Islam's conquest, its mentality for control, and the various ways that it is engaging in infiltrating the West. Now, what we've seen so far, you've heard about jihad, lawfare, nuclear programs, and terrorism. But let's break it down. What is jihad?
Jihad's the holy war. How do you engage in the holy war? You use the legal system as part of it. Sure, you use airplanes and turn them into bombs and run them into buildings. You use suicide bombers. You try to take over governments. But you also use the legal system, both domestic legal systems in the United States, but international legal systems as well, including the United Nations. And then, of course, there's nuclear programs. The danger of a nuclear threat is significant. It becomes part of the terrorist ploy, but is a ploy with tremendous consequences. The situation in Iran is not that much different than 32 years later as we look at the situation in Egypt. A lot of the issues that have developed over the last several months have revolved around the fact that what role would the Muslim Brotherhood have in a government in Egypt? And the short answer to that is any role for the Muslim Brotherhood starts looking an awful lot like Ayatollah Khomeini revisited. Now, I had the chance to sit down with someone who has been to the region in the Middle East many, many times. That is Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Let me ask you first, your sense when you talk about radical Islam, how significant is the conflict with radical Islam and its impact it's having not only in the region, but around the globe?
Jay, it's existential for us. Radical Islam intends that all of us live under Sharia law. They are willing, and not just willing, but intend to die to make it happen. Of course, there's no greater honor than to kill an infidel in the process of getting killed yourself. And so if you look at what we've been up against, not really since 2001, actually going back to 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini goes back to Qom from Paris and begins to organize not the Iranian Revolution, but the Islamic Revolution.
Ayatollah Khomeini left Tehran and moved to Qom, which is Iran's holy city, where he lived until the Shah deported him 15 years ago and may now wish he hadn't. He said as he went he would keep control of the country, as he put it, for the 1 or 2 years he has left to live.
Ayatollah Khomeini returned to the Shah's least favorite city, Qom, where religious opposition to the Shah began.
Everybody looked at it, and I confess to being part of the Reagan administration 1981 onwards. We looked at it as, look, it's just 10% of Islam. We don't have to worry about this.
Khomeini was forced to leave Qom 15 years ago after the Shah's troops killed hundreds of people in an unsuccessful purge of dissidents. But Khomeini indicated he will maintain control and direction of the government because he believes there should be no separation of church and state. And Khomeini said he does not want a democratic republic. He wants an Islamic republic.
It has become a global threat. It's a threat right here in the United States of America. And it's growing. It's growing in large part because we have a commander-in-chief, head of state, chief executive, who refuses to name the enemy. The enemy is radical Islam.
President of the United States goes to the University of Cairo. He says that America, although there's a lot of Christians, we're not a Christian nation. We're not a Jewish nation. He says we're a nation of principles, which is a non-statement. Then you look at the fact, what you just said, that in 1948, our leadership, the government, and others in the world understood that there was this spiritual bond, if you will. Now we have this complete shift in relationship. You've got an Iranian threat that most of us believe is real, but you've been there more than most people. You know the people involved, you know the military, you've reviewed the documents, you've seen the evidence, you've been there firsthand. How serious is the Iranian Islamic threat to world stability?
It will change the world as we know it today if the Iranians, and I believe that they're headed in this direction, put on the end of one of those North Korean provided missiles anything that looks like a warhead. And the Iranians are building not only the warheads, they have the means of delivering it, and I'm telling you, target number one is Israel. The Israelis cannot abide that. It is truly an existential threat.
I was at a board meeting at Jews for Jesus, and the executive director said, we've got a case. The Supreme Court had just granted review. It was about literature distribution at airports.
We wanted to have the Bible study meet in the school, but it turned into a problem when the principal said, no, you can't have it.
I told her that I wanted to sing Noel, and she said, the principal said that we can't have anything to do with Christ in our songs.
We marched around the country defending evangelism in Chicago, in Boston, in New York, Atlanta, Texas, Southern California, Northern California, and points in between.
We got a letter one evening from the IRS saying they wanted all this information that we all knew immediately was not right.
How do you fight the government? How do you fight the IRS?
Tea Party groups say they're being targeted by the Internal Revenue Service, and they're enlisting the aid of the American Center for Law and Justice.
They were trying to shut groups down that they disagreed with. This was very, very serious.
The federal courts do not need to become monitors of state trespass actions, and that's all this is.
We were looking for the right to speak our minds and our consciences, and we won that right today.
Religious persecution is a situation where your life is literally put in jeopardy simply because of what you believe.
Can you help? Can you do something? He's on death row, and so we launched an international campaign. His freedom now rests solely on diplomatic efforts by the United States government and world leaders dedicated to human rights.
The release of Andrew Brunson. He is the American evangelical from North Carolina, held in Turkey for more than 2 years.
There was an Air Force plane that came from Germany that had been on standby. We're flying and they finally left Turkish airspace. It's like, okay, we're really out of Turkey and free again.
We're going to go right back to our film, The Export. This information so important because of the threat Iran could pose and will likely pose under a potential Biden administration. We have to prepare for it and make sure you support the work of the ACLJ. And our office, ACLJ Jerusalem, is because of your financial support. Double your impact at aclj.org, the matching challenge, month of December. Donate today. Let's get right to The Export.
As a lawyer, I like to deal with evidence, and part of that evidence is to actually take you to the region where the conflict is developing. That is, as Oliver North just said, an existential threat in the Middle East, so we traveled to Israel, where the opportunity to talk with members of the military, members of the government, some of the leading journalists in the area, to get a first-hand look at how the threat of radical Islam and Iran impacts Israel, the region, and the world. I had a chance to sit down with one of the most noted journalists in the Middle East, Renan Bergman, to get his impact and impressions as to what's happening in the region right now as it relates to Iran and possible war and conflict with Iran.
First, very basic and fundamental question. Is there a war going on with Iran right now?
This is the longest ongoing war in the Middle East. It has been taking place since Ayatollah Khomeini took over the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 1st of February 1979. It has been going on every day until this minute. Under the public's radar, nobody knows the full details of that, but from almost day one, the Islamic Republic of Iran tried to obtain nuclear weapon and tried to export the revolution to proxy jihadist movement in the Middle East, trying to imitate the geniuses in the revolution of Khomeini to other places. And at the same time, the secret services of the United States and Israel declared war on Iran, and this is the clandestine war between these two forces.
Iran was a free country. One has to remember, under the Shah, very advanced, very Western, very scientifically very impressive. It was taken over by this regime of fundamentalism and really black night that came over Iran. So definitely America stands and works for the values that Iran is against. But there's a special role for Israel here. Iran uses rhetoric that we haven't heard for decades. Eliminating Israel. Israel should not exist, has no right to exist. Israel, I quote, is a cancerous tumor that should be removed from the Middle East. It's said again and again. So when you see a country that says you are not legitimate, you will not exist in the end of the game here, and we go nuclear and involved in terror like no other country, to put it in an understatement, it's a cause for concern.
Well, you have to understand what is at stake. What is at stake is your whole war against international terrorism, when you get the biggest supporter of international terrorism in the world under a nuclear umbrella. What is at stake are your alliances, not just with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain. All those countries are looking for American leadership. And if they feel completely unprotected, well, what you're going to get is a Middle Eastern version of Fitlinization. They will begin to receive Iranian delegations, and they'll try and make do with the Iranian leadership. What that does for the supply of oil in the future, for the price of oil, and basically the whole global balance of power, doesn't look good.
Sanctions so far had tactical successes, but they did not reach the strategic goal. The strategic goal is to convince the Iranian regime that if they continue the project, the sanctions would cause demonstration in the street and the collapse of the regime. Sanctions must convince the Iranian regime to rethink the whole project over again and cancel it. If sanctions won't work, and so far they don't, Israel would take the decision, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, or for that sake, any other Israeli Prime Minister, would take the decision, launch the bombers, call for the strike over the Iranian nuclear sites, knowing that it would bear severe consequences, but still would not let Israeli and Jewish population be under threat of annihilation. The trauma of the Holocaust is so strong and is so inherent to the Israeli genome, to the Jewish genome, that no Israeli Prime Minister will let a hostile country that calls for the destruction of Israel have the capability to execute such an extinction.
Is your sense that the goal here of Iran is simply the desire to annihilate Israel? They talk about that openly. They say, we want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. But they really are looking much broader than that, aren't they? I mean, Israel is kind of in the way from the rest of the conquest.
Yeah, the main reason for trying to achieve a nuclear capability is to be able to cope with Israel and probably to destroy Israel. Because once they will have such a bomb, they will face a very, very huge temptation to use it. And I think that they might use it. I don't want to be like a rat in a lab, waiting to see either the Iranians will use a bomb once they have it, or they will not use it.
Nobody knows whether they would use it. Normally speaking, one assumes that if somebody is producing a weapon, they have the intention of using it. But in the nuclear field, it's different. The United States and the Soviet Union produced nuclear weapons for scores of years, but they never used them. And there was a mutual deterrent, as you know. Right. So whether Iran would want to use the weapon, I do not know. I think they themselves do not know yet. But they certainly would like to have the option of having such a weapon, as I said, in order either to use it in certain circumstances or to use it as a threat to extort from countries in the region concessions which they would like these countries to make on the political field, on the strategic field, on the economic field, and on other fields.
I think that the Iranians have demonstrated a pragmatic and rational policy when the regime was under threat of annihilation. They know that Israel would strike them back with nuclear weapons. They know that Israel would put them back to the Stone Age. And from their point of view, their survival in the regime, in this rotten, corrupted regime, is the sole or the central reason. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I don't think that they would use it only if they're back to the war. However, Israel and the United States should do whatever they can to prevent Iran from being nuclear, from getting the nuclear capability, because A, it would prevent any sort of retaliation against Iran. Second, Iran would become completely rogue in its support to jihadist group. Third, it would start a nuclear war race in the Middle East. And you know, this is something you know where you start, but once Sunni, so-called moderate countries like Egypt, like Jordan, like Algeria, like Saudi Arabia would acquire a nuclear weapon, this is going to be a very unpleasant place to live in.
There is a way to put the Iranian regime, first of all, in a dilemma, whether to become nuclear or to survive. And by putting this regime in the dilemma, I believe that at the end, they prefer to survive. And it should be a strategy consist of 4 elements: political isolation of the regime, crippling economic sanctions, Western support to the internal opposition in Iran, and a credible military option to convince the Iranian regime that there is no way to escape or to get away with a nuclear option. And as Supreme Leader Khamenei in 2003 decided to suspend the military nuclear option when he thought that he might be targeted in the third phase of the American offensive after 9/11, has he preferred survivability, I believe that again he will prefer survivability.
Is this a war we win or can win?
the war with Iran?
This is a war that we can win if we are stubborn and not let the other side have the upper hand in the initiative. This is a war that if the United States and Israel are persistent, can be won. But in order to win this war, the threat must be truly perceived. And I'm not sure that by all Americans, and by all Europeans for that sake, the extent of the threat is well perceived and understood.
First of all, you call the enemy what it is. Sun Tzu, who's the great military philosopher and theologian of ancient China, wrote that if you don't know your enemy, you will lose to your enemy. So first of all, you've got to name the enemy.
And I hope that the American people will educate themselves of what a Sharia is, what Islam is, and what the purpose is.
The United Nations is not going to stand up to radical Islam. The United States has to lead pro-Western democracies with that Judeo-Christian foundation to what those democracies are all about, and realize that's the future for all of us.
Anti-government protests in Iran growing more violent by the day with no signs of letting up. It's the biggest uprising in Iran since 2009 during President Obama's first year in office.
Breaking news on Iran and those demonstrations that we've seen there with a number of people killed over the last few days. Demonstrations against the government across a number of different towns and cities.
President Trump turned to Twitter to talk about the protests that we are seeing. Let's take a look at that. Iran is failing at every level despite the terrible deal made with them by the Obama administration. The great Iranian people have been repressed for many years. They are hungry for food and for freedom. Along with human rights, the wealth of Iran is being looted. Time for change.
We have seen protests springing up around the country, and that is the really key point about these protests. It's not the urban elite that are taking to the streets. It's the regime's conservative base as well. The crackdown also appears to be intensifying. Iranian state media reporting hundreds of people have been arrested and at least 20 people killed. There is a real tension in Iran between the stagnant economy and the people there and the regime's ability to deliver on some of the economic promises that they have offered in the past.
This regime tries desperately to sow hate between us, but they won't succeed. And when this regime finally falls, and one day it will, Iranians and Israelis will be great friends once again. I wish the Iranian people success in their noble quest for freedom.
If the Iranian dictatorship's history is any guide, we can expect more outrageous abuses in the days to come. The UN must speak out. In the days ahead, we will be calling for an emergency session, both here in New York and at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. We must not be silent. The people of Iran are crying out for freedom. All freedom-loving people must stand with their cause. The international community made the mistake of failing to do that in 2009. We must not make that mistake again.
This is a threat to the United States, Jordan.
Absolutely. A huge threat to the U.S., but we've got the team ready to keep you updated and ready to fight. Remember, December Matching Challenge Month. Support the work of the ACLJ at aclj.org. Donate today, aclj.org. Double the impact of your donation. It is so important, folks, because this is critical work that we are going to be doing and engaging all of our international offices as well to fight back against what could be Iran on the move once again.
Here's what I want to say to our ACLJ members, or for those of you that enjoy watching this broadcast. Whether it is going after the deep state, whether it is litigation that we're engaged in, whether it is defending the persecuted church and getting individuals out of prison because of their faith in other countries, whether it's training lawyers to fight for religious liberty, not just here in the United States, but around the globe, whether it is producing a daily, 5 days a week, 1 hour live television and radio broadcast heard on thousands of radio stations, on TV platforms, on social media platforms. Your support of the ACLJ enables us to do all of this. We want to encourage you to support the work of the ACLJ. And when you do that, you're supporting our production teams, our videos, whether it's that kind of production and other things that we are working on. The ACLJ is front and center on this. We're in a matching challenge campaign. Any amount you donate, we get a matching gift for. Go to aclj.org today. That's aclj.org.